You can all be turning to Luke 17, actually, to change things up for today. Luke 17 is where we will spend most of our time. Okay, well, even though I had you turn to Luke 17, we are still studying through Matthew's Gospel, still trying to make it through the sixth section of Matthew's Gospel, as I've outlined things. And of course, that's the section that describes the final visit Jesus made to Jerusalem just before his crucifixion. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. This is, so to speak, the final confrontation before he lets them, do according to their will with him. But of course, all of that is God's will as well, for him to be crucified and raised up from the dead. Nonetheless, this is his last chance to say everything on his mind before he has to be silent like a lamb before its shearers, as Isaiah has said. Now, in this section, we're in the final portion of it. We have been for some time, of course. And this final portion is entirely given over to a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples, and we call this the Olivet Discourse. And in Matthew's Gospel, that is chapters 24 and 25. Two other Gospels, of course, record the same sermon, and of course the various forms that our Gospel authors do, but three of the four Gospels record this sermon, so it's an important one. And when you look at its subject matter, it certainly is. Because in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. Now, most recently, we've been studying how Christ exhorted his disciples to be alert for the day of his return. And there's a lot more coming on that as well. But at the same time, we have to sort of take a bit of a break from that to do something else that I plan to do today. Because with all of this, we come to something of a turning point in the Olivet Discourse. Things are not going to be the same afterward from here on out. We've made it through about half of the entire Olivet Discourse in terms of just kind of counting the verses. And in what we've done so far, we have provided answers, hopefully good answers, for nearly all of the major questions about the Olivet Discourse. Not all of them, but nearly all of them. We've been doing a lot of the difficult, why this, why that kind of work that we do when we work through a passage like this. In the remaining half, Matthew is going to start giving us parables from Jesus to reinforce his exhortation to be watchful of his return and to prepare us for the final judgment of that time. So the rest of the sermon is not so much, all this information, but it's more exhortation. And my sermons going forward will reflect that. And yet, before we move forward to the last half of the Olivet Discourse, I need to answer the one remaining major question that faces us as we study the Olivet Discourse. And that brings me to my sermon for today. So if any of you have been maybe perhaps overwhelmed by these kinds of sermons, this will be the last of them, I think, for the remainder of the Olivet Discourse, and the rest will be the parables that Jesus tells after that. But as for today, we've got some work to do. Today's sermon is going to cover a passage from Luke's Gospel, which needs to be considered alongside the Olivet Discourse, and that is from Luke chapter 17, which is why I had to turn to Luke chapter 17. Now, I'm going to try to show you that Luke 17 represents a correct but somewhat hazy vision of the future from an earlier time in the ministry of Christ. So we're kind of jumping back in time to an earlier part of the ministry of Jesus, where he covered a lot of these same ideas, but in a way that's not quite like what you see in the Olivet Discourse. So that's the agenda for today. And my sermon today is called The First Glance at Future Judgment, because in many ways this is the first time in Luke 17 that Jesus makes the effort to address some of these things at length with his disciples. So the first glance at future judgment. My outline is 4 headings, so I'll tell you what these are to help you follow along as we go. So first I need to read Luke chapter 17, or at least the part of it that concerns us, and also explain its importance for the Olivet Discourse. You might see that just by reading it, but I do want to make some comments to really bring it across to you why it's so important. Secondly, I want to outline the flow of events described in Luke 17. That will probably be, I think it's maybe the longest part of the sermon, just trying to really go in there and just kind of put labels on everything that's happening there. Thirdly, I will show you that Luke 17 does not fit very well with the Olivet Discourse because Luke 17 creates an overlap between separate events. And this will be like the most, I guess the colloquial term would be the hairiest part of the sermon today, just because we're dealing with all the really strange things that I've been dealing with on my own before this sermon and trying to get ready for this sermon. So we're going to argue that Luke 17 doesn't fit very well with the Olivet Discourse because of this overlap it creates between events that should be separate. And then finally, I'm going to suggest an explanation for those oddities in Luke 17. So there are answers coming eventually. Now, because all of this doubtless sounds pretty dry, I want to put it in the context of something that perhaps matters a bit more to us. And I will come around to this passage later on, but just briefly, I want to quote what Jesus says to his disciples on another occasion in John 16, verse 12. This is one of these statements that kind of stand out as we think about things that Jesus said. He tells his disciples, "I have many more things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now." An interesting statement, and raises the question, how does Jesus decide what to tell his disciples and when? Today's sermon is kind of in that context, and I will come back to that verse later and show you how it connects. But in case you're wondering, does this belong to any kind of bigger picture than just the Olivet Discourse and all the rest of history, which Jesus is describing in these passages? Well, that's it. Jesus' way of dealing with his disciples and how he decides to manage their instruction in the kingdom of God. So that is what we're trying to address today as we talk about Luke 17 and the Olivet Discourse and all of that. But first, as the foundation of this sermon, I need to read Luke chapter 17 and also explain its importance for the Olivet Discourse. We have to begin with the very basic information that Jesus has for us in this earlier sermon he gave. Now, before I read the passage from Luke, I want to step back and think about all 3 versions of the Olivet Discourse, which comes later in the ministry of Jesus than this passage we're going to read. I want to step back and think about this. Now, as I've said before, all three of the 4 Gospels record the Olivet Discourse. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this sermon in that last week of Jesus' ministry, talking about the fall of Jerusalem and his second coming and all that stuff. However, each of those authors records the Olivet Discourse in ways that are unique to them. And that's common anytime you're comparing Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes John as well. You see the differences between the gospel accounts and how each of them are kind of doing their own thing, even as they're talking about the same guy, Jesus. They're all unique in some respect. Now, in Luke's case, he's perhaps the most unique in that he records 2 separate sermons from Jesus preached on 2 different occasions, which contain the teachings that we normally think of as the Olivet Discourse. Especially studying Matthew as we have been, Matthew has the longest Olivet Discourse, but when you read Luke's Gospel, you see maybe it didn't quite happen exactly like that, because Luke has these 2 separate sermons. In Luke 21, he has his Olivet Discourse, the time when Jesus on the Mount of Olives with his disciples preached those things to them, trying to explain the future to them. He does that, just like Matthew and Mark, but Luke records another earlier sermon, back in Luke 17, containing other teachings which Matthew and Mark, especially Matthew, in fact mostly Matthew, places with the Olivet Discourse. So there's kind of this, where do we put this material? That's kind of the question going on in the minds of these 3 gospel authors. Where do we put these teachings? Matthew puts them all in one place. Luke has separate sermons in different parts of his gospel. Now, as a result, if you want to compare Luke with Matthew, especially Matthew, then you have to draw from two different places in Luke's gospel, which, believe me, is very challenging. And I know that because I've been trying to do that this whole time. So that is the relevance of Luke 17 to the Olivet Discourse. And knowing that, we can read this earlier sermon from Luke 17. This starts in verse 20 of Luke 17, and we're going to read to the very end of that chapter, which is verse 37. So here we go. It says, "Now having been questioned by the Pharisees as to when the kingdom of God was coming, he answered them and said, 'The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed, nor will they say, Look, here it is, or there it is. For behold, the kingdom of God is in your midst.' And he said to the disciples, 'The days will come when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. They will say to you, Look there, look here. Do not go away and do not run after them. For just like the lightning, when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines to the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out. And likewise, the one who is in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken, and the other will be left. There will be two women grinding at the same place. One will be taken, the other will be left. Two men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other will be left. And answering, they said to him, Where, Lord? And he said to them, Where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered." Now that you know the passage I have in mind for today, I want to explain why it's worthy of a full sermon at this time. Now, for many of the events and teachings in the life of Christ, we have more than one version of those events. We are somewhat accustomed to jumping back and forth between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes John, and comparing the different versions of things that happened in the ministry of Jesus. As a matter of principle, we should not understand any of those accounts in a way which does not work for one of the other accounts. Very often, that's the modus operandi. That's the way we should proceed with comparing these different accounts, very often. And the Olivet Discourse, I didn't want to treat that as an exception to the rule. I didn't want to just ignore other material we have from other Gospels, even if it is kind of in a different place in the Gospel story, like Luke does here. And we have another passage here in Luke 17 that has a lot of the same material. So naturally, I wanted to compare these things together. While teaching through Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse, I have somewhat of an obligation to come back here to Luke 17 and compare these things and make sure that the way we understand things in one place somehow works with the other place, if we can at all possibly do that. That's the fairest and best way to proceed. And that was my motivation for coming back here to Luke 17 and trying to study this passage as well and compare it to what Matthew has for us and make sure everything is fitting together nicely. And my hope was that everything would fit together nicely. Things did not go quite that way, which is why this sermon is going to get complicated later. But that's the idea. We're just trying to do due diligence, you might say, as we compare the different gospel accounts of things Jesus said and did. So at this time, to further that, I want to just outline the flow of events described in Luke 17. Or to put that another way, how is history going to go according to Luke 17? From this time, the ministry of Jesus, onward, how is history going to go? Well, in Luke 17, Jesus seems to predict three different phases of history. And already we're kind of using categories we don't really use over in Matthew as we're looking at the Olivet Discourse. But he seems to have three phases of history. The first phase is a time when the Son of Man himself would suffer many things and be rejected by that generation. So that's phase number one, the suffering and the rejection of the Son of Man. And this phase almost certainly is the ministry of Jesus, because that's how the ministry of Jesus ends. He is rejected, he's put through the crucifixion. There's your first phase. Okay, easy enough so far. The second phase predicted by Christ is characterized by people longing to see one of the days of the Son of Man without seeing any of those days. So there's going to be kind of a longing for Jesus, or something to that effect, but that longing is not fulfilled. Instead, they will only have what appears to be false messiahs and false prophets. Luke doesn't actually say that, but the whole look here, look there kind of thing, it's the same kind of language we do see in Matthew, describing the attempts of false prophets and false messiahs to distract people. So it seems like that's what's in mind, kind of in the background. So this second phase is characterized by not having Jesus, just having all these false people. And I suggest that this phase refers to the time between the ascension of Jesus and the Jewish revolt against Rome. Now, part of that I think you can see, after Jesus ascended to heaven, he's not on the earth anymore. You can see why people would be longing for the Son of Man at that time. As for why I cut it off at the Jewish revolt against Rome, I think you'll see why I do that when we get to the third phase, which of course is where we're going next, what this third phase is. The third and final phase predicted by Jesus is the days of the Son of Man. Excuse me. And he uses that phrase, the days of the Son of Man. Now, the events of this phase, they seem to match somewhat with what we've seen in the Olivet Discourse, but covering both the downfall of Jerusalem and the second coming of Christ, which are events we've discussed at length in the Olivet Discourse over in Matthew. It seems like these days of the Son of Man in Luke 17 seem to correspond to those same things. And we get that just by reading the material that we've seen here in Luke 17 and just thinking about what we've seen in Matthew. They seem to line up somewhat. And that's why I suggested that the second phase refers to the time between the ascension of Jesus and the Jewish revolt against Rome, because then the third phase takes over with this other stuff. So that somehow lines up. So that third phase, that's everything onward then, from the downfall of Jerusalem because of the Romans, and then all the way to the second coming, which also seems to be described. So there's the third phase that we've seen. So we've got those three phases there. We got the first phase, the suffering and rejection of the Messiah. Second phase, the time immediately after that, when people are longing for the days of the Son of Man. And then the days of the Son of Man, which seem to be like a whole huge chunk of history from the downfall of Jerusalem onward to the second coming. Now, having made it to that third phase, we find ourselves asking the question, what will the days of the Son of Man be like? And he certainly spends more time on those days than anything else. So what are we actually talking about? What are the nuts and bolts of the days of the Son of Man? Well, in his own attempt to answer that, Jesus draws a deliberate parallel to the days of Noah and the days of Lot. And you'll notice that he uses those plural, days. So the days of the Son of Man, the days of Noah, the days of Lot. He uses those expressions throughout this passage. In the days of Noah and the days of Lot, most of those days featured nothing remarkable. It's just kind of life as it ought to be. Eating and drinking, buying and selling, getting married, being given in marriage, and all those kinds of things that he describes in this passage. But after all of that came the day. And again, there's an expression that he uses throughout this, the day. The day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came. Also, the day when Lot escaped from Sodom and the fire of God fell. So we've got the days followed by the day, all in that time frame. And that's how Christ describes the days of the Son of Man. Christ implies that the days of the Son of Man will be mostly unremarkable. People will eat, they'll drink, they'll buy, they'll sell, they'll get married. They'll cry at those weddings. They'll do all those kinds of things that people normally do. But after all of that will come the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And that's how he describes it, the Son of Man being revealed. So the days of the Son of Man are mostly unremarkable, except for that last day, the day when he is revealed. And that's how he lays out this third phase of history, the days of the Son of Man. So mostly unremarkable, and then one big show as part of the days of the Son of Man. Now, having seen that, we may want to ask for more detail about that particular day, the day when the Son of Man is revealed. What's that going to be like? What's going on there? Well, Christ actually does try to tell us more about that in this passage. So let's talk about that a little bit. When that day comes, first and foremost, people need to escape, not going back for any belongings, nor even looking behind them, as Lot's wife did when she was leaving Sodom. You might remember when Lot's wife was leaving Sodom, she looked back, was turned into a pillar of salt, and she becomes now the example of someone who was not wholehearted in doing what God wanted, and therefore fell under the judgment of God. In the same way, we should run and not look back. So these are the people who save their lives by losing their lives, if you want to put it that way. They're going to lose everything they leave behind them, but they'll be saved, right? Now, after Jesus describes that in Luke 17, he describes that some people will be taken while other people are left. And he gives 2 or 3 examples of those kinds of people and what's going to happen to them. Well, who are these people? Who are these people that are being variously taken or left? What's going on with them? Well, they're not the escapees. They're not the people that ran away, as Jesus describes just previously. The people who escape are told to leave behind everything. Don't even go back into your house to get your stuff. Therefore, the escapees, as we're going to call them, the escapees, they're not going to have beds or fields or grinding mills, right? Because they've left everything behind. They just hit the road with nothing but the shirt on their back, and they don't have anything else. So they don't have beds or grinding mills or fields or anything like that, as Jesus describes, for these people who are variously taken or left. So these people who are taken or left, these are the people that did not run, right? So they actually technically, didn't do what they were supposed to do. So don't miss that detail. I point that out because I want you to feel my pain a little bit here as I try to study this passage. Christ divides people seemingly into 3 classes. First, those who escape and are saved, and then secondly, those who are taken, and thirdly, those who are left, which is very odd to divide people into 3 groups like that, but here it is in Luke 17. And that is the day of the revealing of the Son of Man in Luke 17. People get divided up in those 3 ways and treated differently, somehow or other. Now, of course, more detail, right? We're going to dive deeper. This is like an onion. We're getting through the rings to the core of the thing here. We got to ask questions about the people being taken. And I've talked about some of this already over in Matthew, so some of this is a repeat. But I just want to say, just kind of point out what is actually happening here with these people being taken and left. Well, a lot of Christians, of course, as I explained in Matthew, suppose that these people are being taken by the Lord to be with the Lord. This is the rapture, as some Christians believe in it, and as some Christians describe it. They're being taken up to heaven, alive, not dying, to be with the Lord. And these people, therefore, end up pretty good, right? They're doing well. However, I do not think that is what Jesus has in mind, neither here nor in Matthew. But a lot of the arguments are the same, of course, but I don't think that's what's going on here. I think these people are being taken in some kind of judgment. So the people taken are being taken in judgment. And I think that for 3 reasons. So first of all, the people who are saved are, in a sense, supposed to be the people who escaped, right? Not the people that stayed behind in bed or grinding at the mill or working in the field. Jesus said, go, get out, run away. And those are the people who presumably are going to be delivered, right? So the people being taken, can't really think of a good way for their lives to end or for things to go for them. Secondly, the disciples ask Jesus where these people will be taken. And Jesus tells them that they can find the corpses by looking for the vultures, which is a very grim way to say it, but here it is, right? I tell you, on that night there will be 2 in bed, One will be taken, the other will be left. There will be two women grinding at the same place. One will be taken, the other will be left. Two men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other will be left. Answering, they said to him, Where, Lord? And he said to them, Where the body is, there the vultures will be gathered. It doesn't sound like heaven to me. It doesn't sound like salvation. It doesn't sound like things end well for the people being taken. So very strange, but it doesn't sound good. Finally, in Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse, we see a similar saying, which we've already studied. So we're going to review that a little bit now. In that saying, Christ says that these people will be taken in the same way that people were taken away by Noah's flood. Right, this was the analogy he made there, of course, very similar to Luke 17 and what's going on here. But the way he words it over there in Matthew, this is Matthew 24, verse 38 through 41. It says, For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other will be left. So from Matthew's wording, we have to view these people as being taken away by the judgment of God in the same way that people were taken away by the flood, which was also the judgment of God. So all of those reasons together make me think that these people being taken are being taken in judgment. But that, of course, we can say then, like, yes, nailed it, we've got it. But then we got these people who are left. And it's like, they didn't run like Jesus said, so can we think that they did well for them? But they're not taken in judgment either. So what's with the people that are left? We got this third category, what do we do with them? And it's so confusing overall. And again, I'm trying to get you to feel my pain here, because I was wrestling with this stuff for months, trying to figure out what to do with Luke 17. And this is one of the questions. What do we do with all this stuff? But that's what we get when we sit here and try to analyze, what are these phases? What are the details? What is Jesus describing for the future here in Luke 17? So let's just summarize what we have so far as well as we understand it, which is not very well, but as well as we understand it, Jesus apparently predicts these three phases of history. You've got the suffering and the rejection of the Son of Man, the longing for the days of the Son of Man, and finally, the days of the Son of Man, which is mostly what he describes here in Luke 17. And as for the days of the Son of Man, they're mostly unremarkable, except for the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So you've got all kinds of business as usual, eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, buying and selling. Life is good, and then boom, the Son of Man is revealed, and all of that goes to pieces. And as for that day, some people will save their lives by losing their lives, kind of escaping and running away, as Jesus said. Later on, everyone will be either taken in judgment or left for whatever reason. We didn't really answer that question, did we? But those are the divisions Jesus makes, this threefold division of people on the day. All very strange, but that's the summary. Those are the things Jesus describes in Luke 17. Now, the great problem with everything I just said, as I'll now talk about in my third heading, is that Luke 17 just does not fit very well with the Olivet Discourse. I tried to make some connections when we were just talking about the three phases, but the more you get into the details, there's all this stuff that doesn't really jive together very well, does it? Now, that's kind of the problem here. As I said at the beginning, whenever you have different versions of the same event in different Gospels, you want to try to put them side by side. You want to look at them together. You want to try to come up with the same explanation for both versions of the events, right? And, doing this here, you would think it would be, doable. You think we could do this. But it's getting really hard based on everything we're seeing. Now, you'll see this problem all the more. And yes, I am ratcheting up the problem here. I'm not giving you solutions yet. We're talking about the problem still. If we go through and talk about the ways that Christians have tried to understand the Olivet Discourse and also Luke 17, if we look at the way Christians have tried to talk about these things, none of them really fit very well for both passages. The earlier teaching from Luke 17 and the later Olivet Discourse, regardless of what gospel you're reading. when we go through the different options that Christians have given, none of them really work very well for both passages at once. So I want to go through that with you and show you just more accurately what the problem is and what we're facing here. And again, this is one of those times where I'm telling you what people have said. I'm not giving you my own point of view yet. This is just talking about what different Christians have said on this difficult issue. So 4 options. Let's talk about them. So first, some Christians assume that these passages are entirely about the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans. Right, we've talked about that for the Olivet Discourse. That's the full preterist position, as I've called it. So they relegate everything back there, 2,000 years ago, to the downfall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. And they try to do the same thing over here in Luke 17 sometimes. However, that leads to a problem. In Luke 17, well, I've told you about the problems in the Olivet Discourse, but in Luke 17, we've got other problems, right? Jesus describes this judgment as coming in a single day, like the flood or the downfall of Sodom, right? Those were very rapid judgments. The flood, you can argue, took time to reach its maximum peak, but come on, it wasn't long before people were drowning, all right? It was a very sudden, very drastic judgment from God. The fall of Sodom was certainly that way. One day the whole city was turned into a cinder, just totally wiped out. So these are very sudden, very sweeping, very universal judgments. However, the city of Jerusalem had a very slow downfall. It doesn't really have that kind of rapid feel to it that the flood or Sodom and Gomorrah had. Those people suffered at their own hands for like 3 years, as we talked about in the Olivet Discourse, and then for several months during the Roman siege. So it was a very long, hard way to just be destroyed. Not at all the kind of sudden thing that we see described here in Luke 17. It doesn't really fit to say that we're talking about just the downfall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. It doesn't work in the Olivet Discourse, doesn't really work here either. So there's that option out the window. To move on to a second option, some Christians assume that both passages are entirely about the far future return of Christ, right? They put everything in days we haven't even seen yet, the days when Jesus actually returns. They do that for the Olivet Discourse. They try to do it for Luke 17 as well. That, however, leads us to another set of problems. And of course, I've talked about in the Olivet Discourse study why some of these things were very much happening back in the first century even. So they're not all far future. But here in Luke 17, we can see problems as well. In Luke 17, Jesus says that people should escape, leaving behind all of their belongings to do so. If you're on the roof of your house, jump down and run away. Don't go back in the house. Remember Lot's wife. That's the way he describes it. But if Luke 17 is about the second coming, why bother to escape? You can't outrun the second coming of Christ. It doesn't work that way. There is no place you can go on the earth. Even if you get out of your city, Jesus will find you, okay? The second coming is that sweeping. Like, you can't just get away from Jesus when he returns. It's kind of the whole idea. This is when the kingdom of God comes in its fullness. Everyone is under the command of God at that point. You can't just run away. It doesn't work that way. Also, this direction to escape requires people to know the day when Christ will return, right? They got to know that he's coming so that they can get out of there before judgment falls. But how are they going to know that? Right? We've already talked about that from the Olivet Discourse. No man knows the day or the hour. You're not going to know that. You're not going to have any warning. You're not going to be able to get out of there. It's not going to work that way. So, much like with the Olivet Discourse, Luke 17 simply cannot be a prediction merely of the far future second coming, as some Christians have understood the Olivet Discourse. So in neither case can we put everything in the far future around the time Jesus returns. So there's a second option out the window for understanding Luke 17 with the Olivet Discourse together. Now the third option is basically what I myself have been teaching you regarding the Olivet Discourse. So this is nothing strange to you. You've heard me talk about this all this time now. And in this case, the Olivet Discourse certainly is more encompassing than just the downfall of Jerusalem or just the second coming of Christ. It's all of that. It's everything from the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ, and everything in between. Jesus trying to give kind of a comprehensive view of the future from that point. Now, and of course, in that understanding, the fall of Jerusalem is separate from the second coming. They're not the same things. I think Matthew has made a very deliberate effort to separate them, and I've talked about all of that, and I've laid all that out, and I agree with all that 100% for the Olivet Discourse. But does it work for Luke 17? No, it does not work. It absolutely doesn't work. As much as I would love it for it to work, I can't actually make it work with Luke 17. Luke 17 just does not follow that timeline. In fact, nothing in Luke 17 clearly indicates Jerusalem as any place of importance. Maybe you didn't realize that. I mean, some of this stuff sounding familiar here. At no point, even in the passage where people are supposed to run away and get out, which is, by the way, what Matthew records for Jesus' commands on the day when Jerusalem comes under attack, he tells them to get out. And you would think that here in Luke 17 it'd be that same thing, but nothing is really that specific. Nothing really flags Jerusalem as any place of importance. And even if we assume that Jerusalem is the place from which people are supposed to escape, Luke 17 joins that escape with other events which seem to refer to the second coming, and it's all thrown in together. Let's read this portion again, just part of this anyway. Let's start in Luke 17, verse 26. And let's read through to the end of the chapter again. And what you're going to see is there's stuff here that sounds like the second coming, then stuff that sounds like what you should do when Jerusalem comes under attack, and then more stuff that seems to be about the second coming. It's all really confusing, but here it is. Let's read it again. And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it will also be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, and building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. It'll be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out. And likewise, the one who is in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken and the other will be left. There will be two women grinding at the same place. One will be taken, the other will be left. Two men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other will be left. And answering, they said to him, Where, Lord? And he said to them, Where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered. Now, all that stuff about fleeing from the housetop over in the Olivet Discourse is about escaping from Jerusalem when things start to go sideways there. So all of that seems to be about the downfall of Jerusalem. But it's surrounded by these other references, which I'm pretty sure you, just reading it naturally, you think of the second coming of Christ when you read those things. And in the Olivet Discourse, that certainly seems to be the case. So it's all jumbled together here in Luke 17. And I have to admit that even though I think the Olivet Discourse gives us a nice, neat timeline of events from the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ, and I think it's all very orderly, I'd expect no less from Matthew. Even though Matthew does that, come over here to Luke 17, it doesn't work so well. So we're kind of foiled here in our third option, the one that I would really like to be true. So that doesn't work. Okay, what's left? We've got one other option left for how to read these things together. Now, some Christians have suggested the idea, not just for Luke 17, but also for the Olivet Discourse, that the downfall of Jerusalem and the second coming are viewed as kind of overlapping events. They're kind of put together so that in looking at one, you see both of them at the same time, pretty much. So overlapping events. Now, when they say the events overlap, they mean that no distinction is really being made between them, between the downfall of Jerusalem and the second coming. They are viewed, for all intents and purposes, as the same thing. Now, different Christians mean different things when they say that. Some people will say that Jesus himself actually expected the downfall of Jerusalem and his return to be the same event, that Jesus himself thought that, and therefore he taught that way. That's how some people understand this idea of overlapping events. Other Christians do it a little differently. They think that he deliberately put them together because one foreshadows the other. The judgment of God that would fall on Jerusalem is in itself a kind of a type of what God would do later for the whole world when Jesus returns. So some Christians take that view of things, and that's their view of why Jesus overlapped these two very different events, because one of them does foreshadow the other. Okay, so different Christians take it different ways, but regardless, there's this idea out there that in these kinds of passages, whether it's Luke 17 or the Olivet Discourse later on, that Jesus is overlapping the events, the downfall of Jerusalem and his second coming. Now, I've already told you in previous sermons, I consider this overlapping interpretation completely unnecessary and even misleading for the Olivet Discourse, which does seem to separate the two major events. Again, I've made that argument as I've taught through the Olivet Discourse. I've tried to show you the distinctions. I think Matthew makes a deliberate effort, more than any other gospel perhaps, to separate those events. I think it's very clear that we have two different events in mind, and that Jesus himself knew that when he was teaching the Olivet Discourse. But here in Luke 17, I honestly see this overlapping interpretation as the only real option to make sense of all these jumbled details we have. To me, it seems to be the only way out, which means I have to view Luke 17 a little differently than I view the Olivet Discourse later on in the ministry of Christ. And so, all that to say, on the one hand, Luke 17 doesn't seem to fit very well with the Olivet Discourse. And yet, we do have an option for explaining that, which is the suggestion that maybe Jesus, in Luke 17, at this earlier phase in his ministry, deliberately overlapped the two events, so that stuff about the downfall of Jerusalem and his second coming are kind of treated all together at once in this way that seems very jumbled to us looking back, but is the way he presented it back there in Luke 17. So this overlapping option for Luke 17 seems to be a real option, and in my view, the only good option, the best option that we have is maybe another way to put that, which is the point where I reached, at some point in my study of these things. But of course, that in itself, it raises another question, doesn't it, right? The question is why? Why do it that way? And that's the theme of my last heading for today, my final heading. I want to suggest an explanation for these oddities. I want to suggest why Christ might have done that. Why would he overlap these two events and kind of jumble it all together earlier in his ministry, only to separate them more clearly later in the Olivet Discourse? Why would he do that? Well, I think we have some answers for that, and I want to talk about those. The first thing I want to say, it's worthwhile to remember that this kind of overlap shows up very often in the Old Testament prophets. This kind of thing, if you've really been reading your Bible for a while and been really trying to understand it, this kind of thing, anyone who's a prophet, it seems like this is how prophecy very often comes out. They see the future, God has shown them things, but they don't really have all the distinctions in place, so it just kind of comes out as one big thing that God's going to do, when in reality, it's actually several things that God is going to do at different times. Now, my example for this is Isaiah. We could go practically anywhere in the Old Testament prophets, but this one I think will be most plain to you. So Isaiah 61 is the chapter I'm going to read. And we're not going to be here long. I just want to read it, and I think you'll see what I'm saying the moment I read this passage. I'm going to read Isaiah 61, verse 1 through verse 5. And just ask yourself, when did these things come about that Isaiah is talking about here? So he says this, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives, and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And now you're saying, that's the ministry of Jesus, right? Okay, well, "and the day of vengeance for our God." Doesn't really sound like the ministry of Jesus, but oh well. Continuing on. "To comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, a mantle of praise instead of a spirit of fainting, So they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Then they will rebuild the ancient ruins. They'll raise up the former devastations, and they'll repair the ruined cities, the desolation of many generations. That sounds like the return from exile, where they're rebuilding everything. What's going on? Strangers will stand and pasture your flocks, and foreigners will be your farmers and your vine dressers. Well, that sounds like the ultimate victory of the people of God against the wicked. What's going on? What is Isaiah doing? What is he got it all jumbled up here? That's how Old Testament prophecy was. It's all jumbled up. I mean, God showed them things that he was going to do, but when it comes out, it's just like, here's the future. Make sense of it. And looking back, we usually have more clarity because we see how God does things. So I bring that up to you just to show that this kind of thing in prophecy is not that strange in and of itself. What is strange, a little strange to us, is that we do expect more clarity out of Jesus. Because after all, we're later on in history. God has actually done some of these things in Christ, and now we see more clearly the division between the first coming and the second coming. We expect more clarity. And of course, Jesus himself is truth incarnate, so we expect everything to be pristine and obvious when Jesus talks about it. And of course, he has his share of cryptic statements as well. But overall, we think of this as the time when past mysteries were made plain. So even though prophecy being a bit jumbled and needing some sifting later on, even though that's common, we do expect a little bit more out of Jesus. So it's still kind of odd to see Luke 17 in this kind of overlapping of events between the downfall of Jerusalem and the second coming. But having said that, I think Jesus, as always, has his reasons. And I think in this case, there is a reason. I think there is a reason why Jesus might have taught about these things a little bit differently earlier on in his ministry than he would later on in his ministry at the Olivet Discourse. And this goes back to the verse that I quoted to you at the beginning of the sermon. This is John 16:12 again, where he tells his disciples, this is of course their last meal together and their last time together before his crucifixion. He says, I have many more things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. So sometimes, we see from this passage, sometimes Jesus pulls his punches a little bit with the disciples based on what they can bear to hear at that moment. And of course, we see the disciples are very often slow to catch on to things, and you can't just overwhelm them with too much truth at one time because they're not going to get it all. It's going to be confusing. It's already confusing for them, and Jesus has to spend a lot of time helping them. So he has a lot of things to say to these guys, but he can't just say everything all at once. He's got to space it out over time to make sure they get it and they can bear these things. Now, I hope you realize by this point in our study of the Olivet Discourse that when the disciples finally understood that Jesus was going away for a while and that he would come back after a potentially long time, that was a bombshell to them. I mean, they had no conception of the coming of the Messiah being like that. There was no conception whatsoever of the Messiah coming twice to do things. They expect, one great big victory and it's all over and good for the rest of eternity. I don't know exactly when the disciples finally figured it out. Jesus certainly tries to explain it to them, but whenever they do finally figure it out that there are going to be two different comings and potentially separated over a long time, that was huge to them. I mean, that was like a totally different way of viewing the plan of God for them. Now, I think it likely that if Jesus had said all of that more plainly at an earlier time in his ministry, the disciples might have been a bit overwhelmed by that knowledge. Like that would have been too much, too fast for them to explain, halfway through the ministry of Jesus, that he's going to go away and come back and who knows how long in between. That kind of thing might have been a bit too much at an earlier phase in the ministry of Jesus. However, by the end of his ministry, after they've been with Jesus for a while, and they're finally getting the idea that things aren't going to be the way they thought they were going to be, giving more information, giving more distinction, more clarity, separating different events, seems to be more possible with the disciples at that phase of time. Therefore, I think that's exactly what's going on here. Luke 17, he's talking about all this stuff. Some of it's the downfall of Jerusalem, some of it's his return. They deserve to be separated because they're different events, but hey, you can't go too fast with the disciples. So the way it comes out, it's all just kind of together. But then later in his ministry, after the disciples have learned to kind of open their minds a little bit more and kind of learn things that are going to be different than what they thought, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus takes some of those things and separates them so that now they're a little more distinct from each other. So now you have the downfall of Jerusalem, this other stuff, and then finally the coming of the Son of Man. More distinct than there are in Luke 17. That, I think, is what Jesus was doing and why these things don't really fit together well. You got to take into account the plan of Jesus in teaching his disciples and not overwhelming them with too much too fast. Now, that leaves just one question, not really a question, but room for some more observation here, and that is how each gospel deals with this, because this is a very unique situation. Like I said, usually when you got the same events or the same teachings from Jesus in different gospels, you put them side by side, you interpret them together, you come to the same conclusions for all of them. But here, you got to treat Luke 17 a little bit differently than the Olivet Discourse, even though it's a lot of the same teachings. Very unique situation. So naturally, if you are composing an account of the life and teachings of Jesus, like our four evangelists were, you got to ask the question, how do we deal with this? What do we do with these different teachings at different times? Well, no surprise, each gospel author dealt differently with this stuff. Now, Luke seems to care the most about preserving each teaching as it was actually given. Luke is the historian of the group, and really, to be fair, they're all historians, but Luke seems to be the one more inclined toward an actual history. He's the real historian among the Gospels. He seems to pride himself on that, the way he introduces his Gospel. So Luke provides, he provides that earlier sermon there in Luke 17, and then later on he gives his own kind of separate Olivet Discourse, and he doesn't really mix the information. He keeps it all separate in its rightful place according to when it happened in the ministry of Jesus. Now, as for Mark, his version of the Olivet Discourse is overall very similar to Luke's, but when it comes to this earlier teaching in Luke 17, Mark doesn't bother. It's just not there. He doesn't record it at all. I mean, Mark is just like, we're going to pretend this first account didn't happen and just go straight to the clear stuff, the stuff where Jesus made everything really clear and distinct, or at least clearer and more distinct. So Mark, he doesn't bother with this earlier sermon. It's just not in his gospel. And he doesn't take any of this earlier information and put it in his version of the Olivet Discourse either. He just kind of says, we're going to deal with this later sermon because it's more clear, more precise. Forget the earlier one. We don't need that. And of course, Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, so he was clearly going for kind of a Reader's Digest version of the story of Jesus. So it kind of makes sense from that perspective to just kind of go with the later, more clear sermon. That makes sense. Now Matthew, he has decided to take the earlier material and fit it into the Olivet Discourse according to where each statement truly belongs. If you read Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse and then read Luke 17 and Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse later, it's like Matthew took all of that, crunched it together, put it over here, but put some of these other teachings where they belong, whether with the downfall of Jerusalem or the return of Christ. So Matthew wanted to be comprehensive, but he also wanted to clarify. He wanted to make sure that when you read these things, you're getting everything in its right order, in its right place, because after all, we're past the ministry of Jesus. Christians have a little bit more figured out than the disciples did originally, so you can handle the full thing. We're just going to put it all together in one big place so you can read it all at once. And that's how the different gospel authors dealt with this stuff. I mean, it's a really challenging thing. It's challenging to really sit here and think about it from the perspective of them writing their gospels. There are questions there about how to do it, but they did it. They all did it a little bit differently. But I think when you sit here and think about it, you can trace what they did and why they did it. But that is my explanation overall for Luke 17, how it connects with the Olivet Discourse, and how to make sense of some of these things that are really confusing at first. Now here at the end, I keep using the expression, feel my pain. I think you can feel somewhat of my pain. Now you're getting a more orderly sermon here at the end of all my efforts here, so maybe you're not as deeply challenged as I have been, but this was really hard to do. But nonetheless, I think that it's worthwhile to do because we can't just ignore this stuff in Luke 17. It's so similar to the Olivet Discourse. We got to bring it in. We got to deal with it. We got to make sense of it. And I do think there are ways of doing that. So I tried to show you that Luke 17, I think, represents a correct but kind of hazy vision of the future from an earlier time in the ministry of Christ. This was the first glance at the future judgment. And again, it was just a glance, right? He didn't specify, he didn't clarify. He just gave them this look at things that are going to happen in the future and didn't really make the effort to distinguish things from each other until later on in his ministry. That's probably the best way to approach the disciples, given the kind of men that they were and how hard it was for them to learn things. So I think it's fair. So again, just to give you my outline again, just to kind of put all these things in their place, let's just review. So first, again, I read Luke 17 and I explained its importance for dealing with the Olivet Discourse. I gave you that flow of events that Jesus gives. So with the three phases, you've got the rejection and suffering of the Son of Man. You've got longing for the days of the Son of Man, and then you've got the days of the Son of Man with all of its confusing details. And then thirdly, I showed you that Luke 17 doesn't really fit well with the Olivet Discourse. I reviewed the different options for making sense of that and trying to fit the two passages together. But eventually I settled, maybe you've settled too. You certainly have permission to think about these things after the sermon is over. But I settled on the explanation that Luke 17 is kind of different from the Olivet Discourse, in that in Luke 17, he takes these distinct events, like the downfall of Jerusalem and the return of the Son of Man, and overlaps them as though they were one thing, whereas later on he tries to distinguish them in the Olivet Discourse. So my explanation for that was simply that Jesus, as his teaching of the disciples, doesn't want to overwhelm them with too much. So he kind of teaches the simplified overlapping version earlier. And then at the Olivet Discourse, after they've matured a little bit, he gives them more distinctions. Things are a bit more clear. And, that's kind of the more thorough, the more precise version of these things that Jesus was trying to teach about the downfall of Jerusalem, yes, but also about his return. So that is how I deal with Luke 17 and the Olivet Discourse together. And of course, as complicated as it is, I fully expect you might need to think about this stuff for a while, but that's my explanation as well as I can give it. Next time, we'll be back in Matthew, and we'll be looking at these parables that Jesus tells. And again, these parables are more like exhortations. We will not, we're only halfway through the Olivet Discourse, but in terms of my preaching through it, we are over halfway through. The parables are going to be treated very much the way they were meant to be, as exhortations to you. So we'll do that, starting with the parable of the thief next time I teach. So that's where we're heading next, over in Matthew. Now, I am afraid to ask, but are there any questions or comments about these things here at the end of the sermon?